The air in the Café Grand was thick with a good kind of warmth. It wasn't just the heat from the espresso machines hissing like tiny dragons, or the golden glow from the crystal chandeliers. It was the warmth of money, old and comfortable, of conversations that cost more per minute than most people made in an hour. The smell was a rich mix of dark roasted coffee, melted chocolate from the famous Sachertorte, and the faint, clean scent of perfume that came from bottles smaller than your thumb. She moved through it all like a ghost, a silent figure in a stark black dress and a white apron that was already showing a faint splash of milk near the hem. Her name was Elena, but here she was just Fraulein, or a gentle nod of the head. Her feet, in sensible black shoes, ached with a dull, familiar throb. She'd been on shift since noon, and the clock over the ornate bar now ticked steadily towards 9 in the evening. Her eyes, a quiet shade of hazel, took everything in without seeming to. She saw the elderly couple in the corner celebrating an anniversary with champagne, their wrinkled hands touching over the small table. She saw the group of businessmen, their ties loosened, talking in low, serious voices about deals and mergers. She saw the well-dressed tourists trying to look as if they belonged, their eyes wide as they glanced at the prices on the menu. And she heard the music. Always she heard the music. The Café Grand always had a pianist. It was part of its charm, a tradition as old as the polished wood panels on the walls. Tonight, it was an older man with delicate fingers, playing a gentle stream of Mozart and Schubert. It was perfect, inoffensive background music, like another layer of the expensive wallpaper. Elena's tray was a testament to the evening's orders. A delicate porcelain cup half filled with the thick sludge of an Einspanner coffee. A plate with the last crumbs of an apple strudel, the fork placed neatly on the side. A smudge of whipped cream on the rim of a glass. As she walked back towards the kitchen, her path took her close to the piano. Her body moved on autopilot, her steps careful and balanced, but her head turned, just for a second. Her eyes followed the man's fingers. They danced over the keys, sure and practiced. And her own fingers, curled around the edges of the heavy tray, moved. Just a tiny, almost invisible tremble. A tap of her thumb against the aluminum. A slight flex of her index finger. It was a reflex, a whisper of a habit she thought she had buried. She wasn't just tapping a random rhythm. She was tapping the precise, intricate left-hand pattern of a Bach fugue she had learned a lifetime ago. The motion was so small, so private, she was sure no one could see it. She was wrong. At table 7, by the window overlooking the softly lit square, sat an old man. He came every Thursday, always alone, always ordering a Milan coffee and reading the newspaper from front to back. His name was Herr Zimmer. He had a kind, wrinkled face and eyes that missed nothing. He had been a music teacher for 45 years before retiring. He heard more than just notes. He heard intention. He heard history in the way someone touched an instrument. He had been watching the Waitress for weeks. Not in a strange way, but in the way a retired craftsman watches a younger person handle tools. He saw the grace in her movements, the efficient, almost musical flow as she navigated the crowded room. And tonight, he saw the tap of her fingers on the tray. It wasn't nervous fidgeting. It was rhythm. It was practiced. It was knowledge. The featured pianist finished a piece with a soft, rolling chord and received a smattering of polite applause. He stood, gave a small bow, and stepped away from the piano for his scheduled break. The beautiful, glossy black Steinway sat alone under its small, focused light, looking suddenly empty and quiet. The background hum of conversation seemed to grow louder to fill the space. Elena was clearing the cups from a nearby table, her back to the piano. She felt the change in the room's soundscape. The absence of music always felt like a missing tooth to her, a weird, hollow gap. She stacked the saucers neatly, her mind already on the next task, refilling the sugar balls at the service station. "Excuse me, Fräulein?" The voice was gentle, raspy with age. She turned. It was the old man from Table 7, Herr Zimmer. He had folded his newspaper and was looking at her with a soft, curious expression. "Yes, sir?" "More coffee?" she asked, her voice quiet and polite, a perfect service industry tone. "No, no. The coffee is perfect, as always," he said. He paused, his eyes glancing towards the empty piano, then back to her. He leaned forward just a little. "The piano," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It looks a little lonely now, don't you think?" Elena gave a small, non-committal smile. "I'm sure the pianist will return shortly, sir." "Perhaps," Herr Zimmer said. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. "But you see, I have been watching. I have seen how your fingers speak." He nodded towards the tray she held. "Even when you are carrying the world on a plate, they are singing a different song. A much more interesting one, I suspect." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The polite smile froze on her face. A flush of heat crept up her neck. It felt like being caught in a secret, one she had kept locked away so tightly. She felt suddenly exposed, as if her private thoughts were on display. She instinctively curled her fingers tighter around the tray, hiding them. I don't know what you mean, sir," she managed to say, her eyes dropping to the floor, Herr Zimmer's expression softening. He didn't look like he was making fun of her. He looked genuinely interested. "I was a teacher," he said, "for many, many years. I know the look. I know the feel of music in someone's bones. It is not something you can just switch off." He gestured again to the grand piano. Its lid was propped open, inviting. "It is just a short break. The crowd is comfortable. They would not mind a little something different. Would you play for us? Just one piece?" The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and the old man. The clatter of the kitchen, the laughter from the businessmen, the clink of china, it all faded into a dull roar. Her heart was now pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. Asterisk play? Here? The idea was absurd, terrifying. This was not her world. She served this world. She cleaned up after it. Her eyes flickered from Herr Zimmer's kind, expectant face to the magnificent piano. In the soft light, the keys seemed to glow, white like bones, black like shadows. A deep, hungry longing, a pain she had worked so hard to numb, rose up in her chest, so sharply it was almost physical. It was a mix of fear and a desperate, terrible want. Then her gaze snapped across the room to the manager. He was a severe man in a perfectly fitted suit, standing by the service door with a clipboard, checking his watch. He was the law here. He represented rent and grocery bills and the fragile stability of her life. He would never allow it. It was unprofessional. It was not in the job description. The waitresses were background scenery, not the evening's entertainment. Herr Zimmer followed her look. He saw the fear, the calculation. "Just ask him for 5 minutes," he urged gently, his voice a lifeline. "Tell him it is for an old, sentimental customer's request. What is the harm?" The war inside her was silent but violent. On one side, shame, embarrassment, the very real risk of losing the job she desperately needed. On the other, a single tiny chance to touch that world again, to feel the keys under her fingers, to be something more than the girl with the tray for just a few minutes. The memory of how it felt to make music, to really make it, not just hear it, washed over her. It was like remembering the sun on your skin after years in the cold. She looked at Herr Zimmer. She looked at the piano. She took a deep, shaky breath that did nothing to calm her nerves. And then she gave a single, sharp nod. The single nod she gave felt like it had moved a mountain inside her chest. It left a hollow, trembling space behind. Now she had to actually do it. She walked towards the service door, her legs feeling like they were made of wood. The tray in her hands was suddenly a foreign object. She set it down on an empty side station with a soft clatter, the sound too loud in her own ears. She wiped her palms, which were slick with a cold sweat, down the front of her black apron, leaving faint damp streaks. The manager was still there by the door, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was a man who prized silence and order above all else. A dropped fork was a minor tragedy. The idea of a waitress playing the piano would be, in his mind, pure chaos. She approached him, her throat tight. "Excuse me, sir?" He glanced at her, his expression already impatient. He had a list of things to do before closing. "What is it?" "Table 20 needs their check." She swallowed. "It's a guest at table 7. The older gentleman. He has asked if I might play the piano, just for a few minutes, during the break." The words tumbled out too fast as she winced at how silly they sounded. The manager's eyebrows shot up. He looked at her as if she had just suggested they start serving soup on the ceiling. "Play? You? The piano?" His voice was flat, disbelieving. He insisted, as a personal request. She forced herself to meet his eyes, though every instinct told her to look at the floor. It would only be for one piece. 5 minutes at most. A low chuckle, devoid of any real humor, escaped him. He shook his head, looking past her towards the elegant room. "Absolutely not. This is the Café Grand. We are not a talent show. We have a professional pianist for that." He tapped his clipboard. "Your job is to serve, not to perform." The refusal was like a bucket of cold water, but strangely, it sparked a tiny flame of defiance in her gut. She had already crossed the biggest bridge in her mind by saying yes to the old man. This manager, this job, it was all part of the life that had buried her music. She took a small step closer, her voice dropping, pleading but firm. "Sir, please?" "He is a regular. He is very kind. It would mean a lot to him. I will be quick. You can deduct it from my break time." She was bargaining now, and it felt pathetic, but she couldn't stop. If it is terrible, I will stop immediately. You can tell everyone it was a silly joke." He studied her face. He saw the desperation, but also a stubborn light in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. He thought of the old man at table 7. He was indeed a regular, a quiet spender who never caused trouble. A small, cynical part of him also considered the spectacle. If it was bad, it would be a story. If it was somehow passable, it might be a quaint bit of charm. The featured pianist was on a 20-minute break. The silence was already stretching a bit thin. He let out a long, exasperated sigh, as if the weight of the entire Viennese coffeehouse tradition was on his shoulders. 5 minutes, he said, his voice a low growl. Not a second more. And if you embarrass this establishment, if you drive even one customer away with a sour note, it is not just your break you will lose. Do you understand me? The threat was clear. Her job, her fragile livelihood, hung on the next 5 minutes. She nodded, a quick, jerky movement. "Yes, sir. I understand. Thank you." She turned away before he could change his mind. Her heart was now hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. The walk from the service door to the center of the room where the piano sat felt like the longest walk of her life. A few guests noticed her movement, their eyes following the waitress, who was now without her tray, walking with a strange purpose towards the instrument. Ah! Gentle murmur rippled through the section of tables nearest the piano. Whispers behind hands. curious, slightly confused glances. Who was this? The new pianist? She was dressed like staff. She reached the piano. The polished black wood reflected the chandelier light in a soft blur. Up close, it was even more imposing. This was not the worn, out-of-tune upright of her childhood home. This was a machine of beauty and precision, a king among instruments. For a dizzying second, she feared touching it, as if her fingers would leave stains. She pulled out the heavy piano stool. The scrape of its legs on the floor was a harsh sound in the hushed room. She sat down. The seat was still warm from the previous pianist. The feeling was oddly intimate, unsettling. She looked out for a second. A sea of faces looked back. Some were politely curious. Some were openly skeptical, eyebrows raised. The businessmen had paused their talk, watching with amused smiles. The elderly couple held hands, their expressions gentle and encouraging. And at table 7, the old man, Herr Zimmer, gave her the smallest, most firm nod. It was a signal. You are here now. Go. Her hands lifted from her lap and hovered above the keys. They looked wrong to her. These were not a pianist's hands. They were reddened from hot water and detergent. A small healing burn from the steam wand marked the back of her right hand. A waitress's hands. They shook visibly. The first notes she played were a betrayal of that shaped dot. It was a simple children's melody. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The notes were thin, timid, each one placed with painful care, as if the keys were made of eggshells. The sound was so basic, so quiet, it was almost swallowed by the rustle of a napkin, the clink of a spoon in a cup. A wave of heat flooded her face. She heard a soft, suppressed chuckle from one of the businessmen's table. This was a mistake. A huge, public, humiliating mistake. The manager's warning echoed in her ears. She was embarrassing the establishment. She was going to lose everything for this pathetic tinkling. Her vision blurred with the threat of tears of shame. She wanted to stop, to get up, to mutter an apology, and flee back to the kitchen where she was invisible and safe. But stopping felt like an even bigger defeat. The old man's kind eyes were on her. The memory of the hungry longing that had propelled her here surged back, stronger than the shame dot. This simple, stupid melody was not her. It was a ghost, a placeholder. The real music, the storm that lived inside her, was screaming to get out. It was buried under years of silence, of bills and tiredness and loss, but it was not gone. It was a wild thing, caged and furious. She closed her eyes tightly. She blocked out the elegant room, the crystal, the silk, the watching, judging faces. She stopped seeing the waitress in the reflection of the polished wood. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she went somewhere else. She went to a small, sunlit room with a scratchy rug. She went to the feeling of her mother's hand on her shoulder. She went to the pages of sheet music worn soft at the edges, to the feeling of getting a difficult passage right after 100 tries, a private victory that felt like flying. Her breathing slowed. The shake in her hands began to still. Her fingers, which had been pecking at the keys like a shy bird, settled. They found a new position, lower, stronger, their pads resting on the ivory with a sense of belonging they hadn't felt in years. The simple melody trailed off into a single low-held note. Then she began to play for real. The low note she held seemed to suck the last of the background noise from the room. It was a deep, vibrating hum that felt less like a sound and more like a shift in the air pressure. Then her left hand moved dot. It wasn't the timid pecking from before. It was a firm, decisive press, and it began a rhythm. A slow, walking, powerful chord progression that was both sad and strong. It was the heartbeat of something enormous waking up. Her right hand joined, not with a melody at first, but with a shimmering cascade of high notes, like sunlight breaking through thick clouds after a long storm. The simple child song was gone, erased as if it had never existed. In its place was a wave of sound that was complex, layered, and full of raw feeling. It was Rachmaninoff. Not the gentle background dinner party Rachmaninoff, but the roaring, passionate, stormy Rachmaninoff of the great concertos, poured into the form of a solo piano piece with breathtaking skill. The transformation in her was absolute. The woman on the stool was no longer a waitress. Her back, which had been hunched with worry, was now straight, yet fluid, moving with the music. Her shoulders, usually tight from carrying trays, were loose. Her face, which had been pale with fear, was now focused, her eyes still closed, seeing only the landscape of the music in her mind. There was a slight frown of deep concentration, but also a softening around her mouth, as if she were greeting an old, beloved friend she thought she had lost forever. The sound filled the Café Grand. It didn't just occupy the air. It changed the very quality of the space. The crystal and the chandeliers seemed to hum in sympathy. The noise from the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, went silent. Someone had likely opened the door to listen out at the table with the businessmen. The amused smiles vanished. One of them, who had been about to take a sip of his expensive brandy, lowered the glass slowly back to the table without drinking, his eyes locked on the figure at the piano. His companion's mouth had actually fallen open a little. The elderly couple in the corner didn't move a muscle. Their hands were still clasped together on the table, but now the grip was tighter. A single tear traced a path through the fine powder on the woman's cheek, though she didn't make a sound to wipe it away. She was hearing her youth in that music, dreams she'd perhaps set aside at table 7. Herr Zimmer let out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His eyes were bright. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped for a nice Chopin nocturne, perhaps a competent Beethoven bagatelle. This was a torrent. This was a professional, world-class performance happening on a coffeehouse floor. He leaned back in his chair, a profound, deep satisfaction settling over him. He had been right. The music in her bones was not just a tune. It was a symphony. Her hands were a blur. They flew across the keyboard with a speed and accuracy that seemed impossible. The powerful left-hand chords anchored the music like pounding waves against a cliff, while the right hand spun melodies that soared, wept, and fought their way through clouds of intricate notes. It was technically dazzling, but it was the emotion that stunned the room. This wasn't a dry recital. Every note was soaked in feeling a deep, aching loneliness in the quieter passages that made hearts clench, and a furious, triumphant energy in the crescendos that made spines tingle. The manager by the service door was a statue. The clipboard hung forgotten from his limp fingers. His severe, businesslike face was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, uncomprehending awe. He looked from the pianist to the room. He saw his elite customers, not annoyed, not leaving, but utterly transfixed. He saw a room that had, minutes ago, been a place of scattered conversations, now unified into a single spellbound audience. The threat he had made felt absurd now, a tiny, mean-spirited thing in the face of this beauty. As she played, the music became more than a performance. It became a story. For those listening, images flickered behind their own eyes. They saw storms over winter forests. They felt the heartache of a long goodbye and the fierce joy of a hard-won victory. They didn't know her story, but they felt its echo in the sound, and she was lost in it. The last thread connecting her to the Café Grand had snapped. She was not there. The coffee smells, the rustle of silk, the weight of their gazes, it had all dissolved. In her mind, she was in a different room. A small, cramped living room in an apartment across the city. The wallpaper was faded. The piano was an old, scarred upright with a sticky middle C key. A woman with kind eyes and tired hands sat on the sofa, mending clothes, a small smile on her face as she listened to her daughter practice. The sunlight came in through a single window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. That was home. That was safety. That was before the sickness, before the medical bills that looked like telephone numbers, before the silence that fell when the piano had to be sold. And the only music was the sound of her own crying. The music swelled, angry and defiant. This was the sound of that loss. The crashing chords were the slam of doors closing. The furious runs were the panic of running towards a future that kept shrinking. Her body moved with the force of it, her shoulders dipping and rising, her whole being pouring into the instrument. Then, as suddenly as the storm had begun, it broke. The music fell into a passage of devastating quiet. The melody, now in the lower registers, was a bare, lonely line. It was the sound of walking home alone after dark. The sound of counting tips, knowing it wasn't enough. The sound of looking at your hands and wondering if they would ever do the one thing they were meant to do again. In the audience, not a single person breathed too loudly. A man in the back, a stern-looking gentleman with a neat gray beard who had been reading a financial paper, slowly folded it and set it aside. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, his eyes fixed on the pianist. He was not just moved. He was analyzing, recognizing a level of artistry that had no business being hidden in plain sight. She built the music back up from that deep sorrow. Note by note, chord by chord, she climbed. It was a struggle, a fight against gravity. The melody rose from the depths, gathering strength, gathering hope. It was no longer just a memory of loss. It was a declaration that the beauty of the memory itself was worth something, that the skill in her hands was still hers, no matter how she had to use them during the day. The final minutes were a breathtaking ascent. The tempo increased, the chords became grander, the runs more spectacular. It was a summit being reached. The light in her mind's eye was no longer the dusty sun of the old apartment, but the bright, focused light shining down on the Steinway's keys. She was here. She was playing. And for these few minutes, she was free. With a final, thunderous series of chords that shook the floorboards and seemed to make the very walls ring, she reached the end. The last note, a deep, resonant boom from the bass, hung in the air, vibrating through the wood of the piano, through the solace of their shoes. And then silence, a perfect, total, overwhelming silence. Her hands fell from the keys and lay still in her lap. Her shoulders slumped, all the energy drained out of her. She was back. The small room vanished. The smell of coffee and chocolate returned. The ache in her feet returned, sharper now. She kept her eyes closed, afraid to open them. The silence felt like a verdict. It felt heavier than any noise. She braced for the polite, confused patter of applause that would say, "That was nice, dear. Now, where is our check?" She braced for the manager's furious whisper, telling her to get back to work. She braced for the laughter that would confirm her greatest fear, that she had just made a glorious, ridiculous fool of herself. She sat in the heart of that silence, waiting for the world to crash back in. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was a heavy, living thing that pressed on the ears after the storm of sound. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room was holding a collective breath, afraid that even a sigh might break the spell that still hung in the air. Her own breath was shallow in her chest. The echo of the final chord seemed to ring inside her skull, replacing the music with a high, thin hum. The world was coming back, piece by piece. The hard feel of the piano stool under her. The rough texture of her waitress dress against her knees. The faint, sweet smell of a nearby pastry she had served an hour ago. This was the worst part, the in-between. A moment after the leap, hanging in the air before you looked down. She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a deep, intense dream. Her vision was blurry for a second, the bright lights of the chandeliers dissolving into starry smears. She blinked, and the room swam into focus. She was looking down at her own hands, resting in the white fabric of her apron. They looked alien to her now. These were the same hands that had just commanded such power, such feeling. Yet there was the little red burn from the steam wand. There was a faint, permanent stain of coffee near the cuticle of her thumb. They were trembling again, but now with exhaustion, not fear. She could not bring herself to look up, to see the faces. The polite confusion, the awkward pity. Maybe the old man at table 7 was smiling kindly, but the others. The businessmen would be smirking, exchanging glances that said, well, that was dramatic. The elegant couple would be looking away, embarrassed for her. The manager would be storming over, his face like thunder. A sound cut through the thick, quiet dot. It was not a clap. It was a sharp, solid thump. Her head jerked up instinctively. It came from table 7. The old man, Herr Zimmer, was not smiling. His face was serious, etched with deep emotion. He had placed his walking cane, which had been leaning against his chair, firmly on the wooden floor. The thump was a deliberate, powerful punctuation mark. He looked straight at her, and then, slowly and with great effort, he began to push himself up from his chair. He was not a young man. The movement was stiff, deliberate. One hand braced on the table, the other on his cane. He rose to his full, somewhat stooped height. And then he let go of the table, brought his hands together, and began to applaud Dot. It wasn't wild, cheering applause. It was slow, measured, and deafeningly loud in the silent room. Asterisk clap, clap, clap. Each clap was a statement. Asterisk, I see you. I hear you. Asterisk, it was the spark. The elderly couple in the corner, their faces wet with tears, were next. The woman stood first, pulling gently on her husband's hand. He rose beside her, and they joined the applause, their hands moving together in a soft, steady rhythm. Then, like a wave, it swept through the room. One of the businessmen, the one who had set his brandy down, stood up. He didn't look amused anymore. He looked stunned, humbled. He began to clap, his eyes never leaving her. His colleague followed, then the whole table. Clap, 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 clap. The sound grew, multiplied, gained speed and strength. It was no longer just polite recognition. It was a roar. It was a physical force. People at the back of the cafe, who had only been able to hear the music now, stood on their toes to see, then joined in, standing up from their plush seats. The stern-looking man with the gray beard was on his feet, applauding with a firm, approving nod. His financial paper crumpled and forgotten on the floor. Dot. The waitstaff had gathered at the kitchen door. The busboy with the acne-scarred cheeks. The other waitress who always complained about her feet. The stern-faced cook and his whites. All were there, peering out. They were clapping too, not for a customer, but for one of their own. Their faces showed shock, then dawning pride. The manager was still by his post. The clipboard had slipped from his fingers and lay at his feet. He was not clapping. He was just standing there, his mouth slightly open, looking from the standing, cheering, weeping crowd to the small, exhausted figure at the piano. The calculations in his head had completely short-circuited. This was not a quaint bit of charm. This was an event, and it had just happened in his cafe. He saw the faces. Not a single person was leaving. Every soul in the room was riveted, electrified. He slowly bent down, picked up his clipboard, and held it against his chest, as if for protection from the overwhelming feeling in the room. She sat in the eye of the hurricane of noise. The applause washed over her, a warm, shocking wave. She couldn't process it. Her mind, so clear and focused while playing, was now a jumble of shattered glass. She looked out at the sea of standing people, their hands moving together, their faces turned towards her. She saw the tears. She saw the awe. She saw the respect. It was the respect that undid her. A waitress is looked through. She is given orders, sometimes thanks, sometimes irritation. She is part of the furniture. She is not looked at. Not like this. This was a look reserved for masters, for artists, for people who mattered. To be seen that way, by all these people in their fine clothes, in this place where she was meant to be invisible, it was too much. A single hot tear escaped her left eye. It traced a clean path through the faint haze of kitchen grease and tiredness on her skin. Then another followed from her right eye. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. She just sat there as the applause thundered around her, letting the tears fall silently, a quiet release of years of pent-up silence. Her gaze drifted across the blurry crowd and landed on the old man, Herr Zimmer. He was still clapping, but he had stopped the slow, deliberate rhythm. Now he was just applauding like everyone else, but his eyes were locked on hers. He gave her a small, gentle smile and a nod that seemed to say, "There, you see?" She tried to smile back, but her lips just quivered. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod in return. "Thank you." The applause did not die down. It seemed to grow, as if the crowd, having found its voice, didn't want to stop. It went on for a full minute, then two. It was a standing ovation. In the true sense of the word, not just people getting up to leave, but people rising to their feet to say something wordless and important. Finally, feeling like she might float away or dissolve if she sat there any longer, she moved. She pushed herself up from the stool. Her legs were weak, like jelly. She turned to face the room fully and gave a small, awkward bow from the waist. It was not a performer's graceful bow. It was a jerky, sincere dip of the head and shoulders, the bow of someone who has no idea how to accept such a thing. This seemed to finally break the dam for the crowd. The unified applause fractured into cheers, a few shouts of bravo from those who knew the word. The sound became warmer, more human, less overwhelming. She stood there for another moment, accepting it, drowning in it. Then, knowing she had to move or collapse, she turned and began to walk back towards the service door. The path through the tables was different now. People reached out gently as she passed. A soft touch on her arm. A whispered, "Thank you." The elderly woman caught her hand and squeezed it, her own eyes brimming. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, her vision blurred by tears. She was almost to the door, to the safety of the kitchen, when a man stepped directly into her path. It was the stern-looking gentleman with the gray beard. He was not smiling, but his expression was intensely focused. He held out a small, crisp white card between his fingers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and quiet, cutting through the residual noise around them. He spoke not to a waitress, but to an artist. That was extraordinary, truly. He pressed the card into her hand. "My name is on there. I am the director of the concert hall. You will call me tomorrow. First thing." He didn't ask. He stated it. Then, with another firm nod, he stepped aside. She looked down at the card. The paper was thick, expensive. She couldn't read the words. They swam in her tear-filled eyes. She just clutched it, feeling its sharp edge against her palm, as she finally stumbled through the service door and out of the sight of the stunned and cheering elite. The service door swung shut behind her, cutting off the roar of the crowd like a knife. Suddenly, it was just the harsh, fluorescent lights of the kitchen, the smell of old grease and disinfectant, the steady hum of the industrial fridge. The contrast was so violent it made her dizzy. She leaned back against the cool metal of the door. The thick white card digging into her clenched fist. The kitchen staff was staring. The busboy, the cook, the other waitress. They weren't clapping now. They were just looking at her with wide eyes, as if she had walked in from another planet. Their silence felt louder than the applause. The other waitress, a woman with tired lines around her eyes, broke the quiet. "That was you?" she whispered, her voice full of disbelief. "All that? That was you in there?" She couldn't answer. She just nodded, her breath coming in short, shaky gasps. The weight of what had just happened was starting to crash down on her. The tears were still streaming down her face, but silently now, a steady leak of overwhelming emotion. The cook, a big man with thick forearms, gave a slow, low whistle. "Holy smokes," he said, shaking his head. "I thought the radio was on or something. That was something else." The manager pushed through the door from the dining room then. The noise of the crowd surged for a second before the door hissed shut again. His face was unreadable, a mask trying to settle in a new shape. He looked at her, then at his staff, then back at her. "All right, show's over," he said, but his voice lacked its usual sharpness. It was almost hollow. "Get back to your stations." The kitchen staff scattered, throwing glances back over their shoulders. He turned to her. She braced herself. This was it. The lecture, the firing, the cold accounting of her transgression. She wiped her face roughly with the back of her hand, the coarse fabric of her sleeve scratching her skin. "You," he began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "That gentleman out there, the one who gave you the card. Do you know who he is?" She looked down at the card in her hand. She still hadn't read it. She shook her head. "He is a very important man," the manager said, his words careful. "In the music world. For the whole city." He paused, his eyes searching her face, as if seeing her for the first time. "He is not a man who gives out cards to waitresses." The words hung in the air. They weren't cruel. They were just a fact that highlighted the impossible line she had just crossed. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "About before. I know I said 5 minutes." He waved a hand, cutting her off. The gesture was impatient, but not angry. It was as if the old rules no longer applied. "Forget it." He looked towards the dining room door. They are still talking about it. No one is asking for their check. They are ordering more wine, more cake, to discuss what they just heard. He sounded baffled, almost amused by the strange economics of it. "You should go home." "My shift isn't over," she said automatically, the dutiful employee reacting on instinct. "Consider it over," he said. He hesitated, then added, "Take tomorrow off. With pay." It was a peace offering, an acknowledgement that the world had tilted. "Just be here the day after. And for God's sake, call that man in the morning." He turned and walked back into the dining room, leaving her alone by the stainless steel counters. The walk home was a blur. The cool night air felt strange on her hot face. The sounds of the city, the trams, the distant laughter, the rustle of leaves in the park, all seemed muffled, far away. She felt like she was floating a few inches above the pavement. In one hand, she clutched the strap of her worn bag. In the other, she held the white card, so tightly her knuckles were white. She lived in a modest building, not far from the city's grand center, but a world apart. The stairwell smelled of cabbage and old wood. Her apartment was a single room with a bed that folded into the wall, a tiny kitchenette, and a window that looked out onto a narrow courtyard. It was quiet. It was always quiet. She turned on the small lamp by the bed, its weak light pushing back the shadows. She sank onto the edge of the thin mattress and finally looked at the card. The paper was thick, creamy. The lettering was embossed, elegant, and serious. It listed a name, a title, *** director, City Concert Hall. ***. There was an address in the most prestigious district, a telephone number. It was a portal to a world she had only ever seen from the very back row. Once, years ago, as a treat she couldn't afford. She laid it carefully on the small table, as if it were made of glass. Then she put her face in her hands. The full force of the evening hit her in a wave that stole her breath. The terror of walking to the piano. The shame of the first, childish notes. Then the feeling of the music taking over, like a dam breaking inside her chest. The roar of the sound, the release of years of silence. And then the standing people. The applause that felt like a physical embrace. The tears on the faces of strangers. The look in the old man's eyes. The firm pressure of the card in her hand. She cried then. Not the silent tears from the cafe, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place of years of held-back disappointment, of grief for lost time, of sheer, overwhelming shock. She cried for the mother who never got to see this moment, who had sacrificed so her daughter could have lessons on that old, sticky-keyed piano. She cried for the version of herself that had given up, that had believed the music was gone forever. When the tears finally subsided, leaving her hollowed out and calm, she just sat in the quiet of her little room. The card gleamed in the LAMPL IGHT. The next morning, the world had not changed. The sun rose over the courtyard wall. The neighbor's radio played the morning news. Her small clock ticked on the shelf. But she had changed. There was a new current running under her skin, a low hum of possibility. She waited until 9 o'clock exactly. She walked to the payphone on the corner, her heart doing that familiar frantic dance again. She fed coins into the slot, her fingers cold and clumsy. She dialed the number. A crisp, efficient voice answered, stating the concert hall's name. Her throat went dry. "Hello," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She cleared it. "Hello. I was asked to call. For the director. My name is..." She gave her name. The name of the waitress. It felt strange to say it into this phone. "1 moment, please," the voice said. The wait felt like an hour. She stared at the graffiti scratched into the phone booth's metal, listening to the static on the line. Then, a different voice. The deep, calm, serious voice from the night before. "Yes, I have been expecting your call. You asked me to call," she said, feeling foolish. "I did. I would like you to come to the hall. This afternoon, at 3 o'clock. There is a piano on the main stage. I would like you to play for me. Not Rachmaninoff this time. Play whatever you wish. Can you do that?" She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the phone booth. "Yes," she whispered. "I can do that. Good. I will see you at 3. The line went dead. That afternoon, she did not wear her waitress dress. She wore the only other nice thing she owned, a simple, dark blue dress that was a few years out of fashion, but clean and neat. She walked into the concert hall through the artist's entrance. As instructed, the main auditorium was vast and dark, a cavern of empty red velvet seats. Only the stage was lit. In the center, under a single ghost light, sat a grand piano even larger and more magnificent than the one at the cafe. The director was there, sitting alone in the 10th row, a notepad on his lap. He did not smile. He simply nodded. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his voice echoing softly in the huge space. This time, there was no fear, no shaking. There was only the piano and the music waiting to be let out. She played for him for 40 minutes. She played Bach, clear and mathematical as architecture. She played a heartbreaking piece by Chopin. She played something lively and modern. She played until she felt emptied and full, all at once. When she finished, the silence in the hall was different. It was professional, appraising. He stood and walked down to the edge of the stage, looking up at her. "You have neglected a great gift," he said, not unkindly. "But it is still there. It is raw, but it is profound." He tapped his notepad. "We will start with lessons, with a proper teacher. Then we will see about a smaller recital here in the chamber hall. There will be an arrangement, a scholarship of sorts, to allow you to work less and practice more." It wasn't a promise of fame. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a door, propped firmly open. It was a path, where before there had only been a wall. She left the concert hall as the late afternoon sun washed the streets in gold. She didn't float this time. Her feet were firmly on the ground. She walked to the Café Grand Dot. She pushed through the front door this time, not the service entrance. The evening crowd was different, but a few faces from the night before were there, and they recognized her. A gentle murmur followed her as she walked to table 7. Herr Zimmer was there, with his coffee and newspaper. He looked up, and his old face broke into a warm, radiant smile. She sat down in the chair opposite him, something she had never done before. "Thank you," she said, the words simple and utterly inadequate. He reached across the table and patted her hand. "No, my dear," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Thank you for the reminder that beauty often hides in plain sight. Now," he said, leaning forward, "tell me everything." And as she began to speak, the featured pianist in the corner played a soft melody. She listened, not with longing anymore, but with a quiet,